Good afternoon. Welcome to our next webinar in the Public Safety Innovation Series. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ari Vidali, CEO and founder of Envisage Technologies, and I'll be your host today. Okay, before we get started, a little bit about us. Envisage Technologies is the leader in training and compliance technology for public safety. We serve over 1.1 million first responders nationwide. In short, our technology ensures that these first responders are trained, equipped, and ready. We started this webinar series because we were frustrated that great ideas and the best practices that are out there, those that can save lives, are just not getting out there fast enough. As you can tell, we're passionate about solving that for public safety and raising the bar on training. We believe that readiness saves lives and are committed to improving public safety through awareness and innovation. Now, today's webinar addresses this topic head-on. High-quality training is key to the success of law enforcement, yet there's a lot of training out there that lacks the instructional rigor and quality our officers deserve. This is why IADLEST, the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training, has led the way on establishing criteria that elevate training quality through the National Certification Program. These standards provide a guide for how to develop courses that effectively engage learners and ensure that training transfer occurs. If you're a course developer, instructor, or training provider, the benefits of developing training using the NCP model are many, not the least of which is that your training will be trusted and accepted for in-service training credit in 35 states without having to seek approvals in each. Our speaker today is dedicated to merging his experience in law enforcement with his passion for instructional design to create high-quality training. His focus on critical decision-making for officers aims to minimize litigation and save lives. Joe Wolf is a retired 30-year federal law enforcement veteran. He served 10 years with the Coast Guard Investigative Service, 15 years with U.S. Customs, and 10 years with Homeland Security Investigations. His last assignment before retiring was as Assistant Director of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we know that as ICE, Office of Training and Development. In this capacity, Joe served as the Director of ICE's Training Academy. He also served 2 terms as the chair of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center's Curriculum Advisory Council. After leaving federal service, Joe was appointed as the very first civilian director of the Albuquerque Police Department's Training Academy. Joe is currently a faculty member of Central New Mexico Community College's School of Health, Wellness, and Public Safety. And Joe has also won the IADLEST Training Innovator Award in 2016 for the excellent work at Innovative Reasoning. Joe, thank you so much for being here to share your experience with us today. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Ari, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you're all here today. When we're tackling the issues connected with law enforcement and other public safety training, in my travels and the times I've spent looking at programs, it's generally I find that the quality of the training is high, it's content rich, and it gives the audience the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they're required to successfully do their job. Unfortunately, the downside of it is that a lot of times it's lacking in the academic science that would give it the credibility and the sustainability that's required to be a part of a nationally accredited program. And this is really where the IADLEST National Certification Program comes in. They set a system of standards for participants to meet that basically assure this kind of quality training and the application of just a little bit of academic science to law enforcement training. And those of you who are career law enforcement or public safety officers, well, it's not realistic to expect you to be academics or instructional designers. But hopefully today, I can show you a few steps in a very simple process that will help you achieve the level of accreditation that will earn you that IADLEST seal of excellence. My work since retiring has largely involved critical decision making and the projects that you see in front of you. These have all been certified by IADLEST National Certification Program, and it's seven of them are instructor-led programs, and one is a computer-delivered program. And again, it was right from the beginning, working with Ari and the folks at First Forward and Envisage. They basically connected me with IADLEST and said, hey, let's shoot for that higher standard, and as you develop these things, let's see if we can achieve national certification for your programs as they roll out of the box. And we're able to do just that, working together. So I really urge you to get engaged in this partnership. You'll find Envisage, First Forward, and IADLEST extremely responsive to your needs, very helpful, and really eager to partner with you to achieve this magnitude of excellence that you're shooting for. It can be intimidating when you look at the rubric that IADLEST has promulgated for its training. It can seem a bit overwhelming, but it's really not. If you use it as a roadmap and follow it as you're going through the development process, you'll find that you hit these targets, and that by the time you're done, it'll require very little adjustment to your program to achieve the standards that they've established. Basically, these are the core requirements for your training package, the general requirements, which we'll talk about in a minute. Objectives and references, an introduction of body, a lesson conclusion, some testing, and some course evaluation and a closing statement, all of which you probably already have as part of your training programs, whether they're under development now or they've already been created. It's just a matter of shaping them, again, with a little bit of academic science and achieving the standards that are set by IADLEST. I know each and every one of you is capable of doing that. In addition, the computer-based training criteria add the requirements about content and outcomes, the assessment and transfer process, your technological design and the technological requirements, and how you operationally run your program and how you support it. So it's a little bit more of a lift for the online programs, but I guarantee you that if a layman like me can slug his way through it, each and every one of you is capable of doing it with just a little bit of tech savvy and a willingness to learn about distributed learning. While we talk today, I'm going to be making a few assumptions about your skill level in instructional design. All of my instructional design efforts are based on the IADLEST model, which most of you are familiar with. And that's the analysis, design, develop, implement, and evaluate model. If you're not familiar with the IADLEST model and I'm not clear on how it's applied to this process, please ask a question at the end and I'll be glad to elaborate. But we're going to assume that you're familiar with this process of instructional design as we go forward from this point. It's really important to have a sound foundation, a policy foundation for any of the training that you develop. One of the things that I've noticed when I've looked at training efforts by agencies is there's very often a weak underlying policy, law, or client specification that's driving it. This has to be locked down before you begin. Training does not drive policy. Policy drives training. So you have to have a sound foundation with basically the underlyings of support that map back so that ultimately, again, as training providers, you understand this, that there's a system of job requirements that are specified in policy. Training has to meet the requirements of the job. Now, based on that, when we get to that point, we develop this knowledge, skills, and abilities that are going to basically map out what the students are expected to learn as they move through the training process. When we're talking about performance-based training, and this is basically the center point of the IADLEST model, performance-based training is based on a system of learning objectives. It's objective-based. It's these objectives that are measurable, observable, and replicable. And these have to be documented, and there has to be a way to do each of those things. Observe it, replicate it, and measure it. And that's one of the toughest parts in performance-based learning, is about what those key metrics are. How do we know what success looks like? These things have to be specified in your learning documentation as you develop the course. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this presentation. Now, performance objectives are something that a lot of officers and training developers wrestle with. But basically what we're talking about for a performance objective is it states a condition, it specifies a performance that's required, and then it specifies what the standard is to meet that performance. So let's use the example of tying a knot in the length of the line. So the condition we're working under is the requirement to tie a square knot in a length of line. The performance is that the participant will be able to tie the knot. That's actually an observable, demonstratable skill. Tie that knot, and the standard is that it's done in less than 30 seconds, and the knot will not unravel when pulled. Now, granted, this is a simplified example, but it shows you that the three steps, the condition, the performance, and the standard, can be applied to any learned skill. Your lesson planning has to specify these in each case for each knowledge, skill, or ability that your training program is intending to teach. Now, one of the things that happens when we're developing performance objectives is we use terms like understand and know and acknowledge. Well, it's really difficult to measure understanding and knowledge. What we want to measure is something that's readily observable to the instructor. So the student has to be able to demonstrate, describe, perform, conduct, list, name. You can see these are very specific activities, and each one of them is observable, measurable, and replicable. And it's really important to keep that in mind. It's one of the key things that the assessors from IADLEST are going to look at when they review your training program, is the quality of your performance objectives. Because the performance objectives are going to be the skeleton upon which you flesh out your lesson plan, which is the backbone of everything you're going to do. The first standard in general requirements for certification is materials are written in a semi-manuscript format. Many of you are probably used to looking at law enforcement training outlines that are simply that, outlines or a list of bulleted statements. The better practice is to basically format your lesson plan as if you were writing a textbook. What's the goal? Well, the goal here is that any qualified instructor, after watching the instruction one time and a bit of study, will be able to take your lesson plan and run with it, and be able to provide your training to the audience just based on the work you've done. So it's a high standard to say, I'm going to put in this binder everything that instructor needs to take my material forward, and it's a lot of work to write it this way, but it's the best way, again, to get that sustainable, replicable training that you're after. Because if you get hit by a truck the next day, what you have, the PowerPoint slide deck that you left on your desk, is not going to be of any use to anybody unless they have the underlying documentation that originated the training. So I really urge you to use this method, writing your manuscript and writing your lesson plan in a manuscript format. And again, going through the standards, and I won't spend too much time with these, but just so that you know how important they are, the assessors who look at your program will actually, literally, be looking in great detail at these finer elements of quality. And this includes the training aids, number 7, and things like grammar, spelling, and punctuation, number 4. You can have your project rejected if it's not conforming to the standards of written English. And that's important, and that's the right decision. The second half of the general requirements include the use of training aids, the student ratios, that you have a schedule and agenda, and that your target audience is specified. And I particularly want to call your attention to number 14. You know, in the law enforcement world, a lot of times we rely on gallows humor as part of a coping mechanism for dealing with the things that we have to confront every day. Well, you have to make sure that if you use things like illustrations and examples, that they're free from discriminatory content, the terminology is professional, and that there's no negative stereotypes in the work you do. This is vitally important these days, and you will not receive the standard of excellence approval if you don't meet that goal. You know, it's a big lift when you're writing a lesson plan, but I guarantee you the quality of your training is only as good as the lesson plan that you prepare. You have to document it properly. The learning objectives have to be measurable. And a lot of the ways that you can do it, you can use your imagination. Tests and quizzes are always just fine. Demonstrations, labs, and practical exercises are even better for the 21st century learner. They get more out of it when they hear your lecture and then immediately go to the application phase where they can see how it works. You must document the content of the lessons and the practical exercises and what the expected outcomes are. Remember, we're working towards performance-based training, so there has to be an outcome that we can observe and measure at the end of learning. This also has to include the task requirements, what's required of the students, and the risk assessment. A lot of the training that we do does have dangers attached to it. Anything connected with firearms, defensive tactics, or driving has risks. You must provide a risk assessment when you're doing anything beyond a simple lecture class. I wanted to show you a couple of examples of this kind of documentation. If you take a look at this right here, this is a practical exercise from the Innovative Reasoning Workplace Violence and Active Shooter Preparedness course that I developed for them. What you'll see here is it's a practical exercise that designates a specification of what practical exercise it is and what enabling performance objective it maps back to. So every one of our performance objectives has to be measured. It has to be measured either through a test, a quiz, a demonstration, a lab, or a practical exercise. So what we're going to do is any of our hands-on training is going to map back to one of our performance objectives. If it doesn't belong in the package. You'll see here that it has a basic explanation of what the exercise consists of, and then what the performance standard is for those exercises. I understand these are small and difficult to read, but it's just to give you a sense of the way that it would be documented. Then down here we have the requirements for personnel, equipment, any safety requirements, anything about role players, and then anything that the participant needs to know. This should capture effectively a summary of your practical exercise. You can add additional sheets behind it for the details, any scripts, any specific scenarios that you want to lay out. But the assessor will see on one page fundamentally what the practical exercise is about and what performance objective it will map back to. There's been a lot of debate, and this goes all the way back to some of you who are old like me can remember when instructors used stacks of foils, transparent foils and an overhead projector to demonstrate a lecture. Well, now we have PowerPoint, and we are all guilty to some extent of beating our students to death with PowerPoints. To hand out PowerPoints or to not hand out PowerPoints, I'm kind of inclined not to hand out the PowerPoints. I think it's a crutch, and I think it doesn't necessarily provide any kind of a useful learning tool for the students. I prefer to actually provide the student with a note-taking guide. And what we're talking about here is they're basically given a lesson plan that's slimmed down, has the key concepts with blanks actually built through the lesson plan so that the student can follow along, fill in the blanks, and it eliminates the need for a lot of extensive writing. You will find students that I'm sure you've seen them that are grinders that try to write down everything you say. Well, that's a distraction that gets that interferes with the learning process. What we want to do is we want to bring the classroom environment, your lecture, and the piece of paper all together in one seamless piece, and a note-taking guide helps the student to do that. A student that doesn't enjoy taking notes or learns better without them will still have the basic framework of an outline to carry away with them. The student who is more of a visual learner and needs to take notes won't be so note-bound. They can just fill in the blanks and the key pieces of information that you're sharing. And here's an example of a reduction of a lesson plan down to a note-taking page. This particular one is from our critical decision-making course of instruction. And if you'll notice the diagram here is about how expertise is built. So basically, the lesson plan shows what the model looks like. The slide in the PowerPoint presentation would show that model. In the student's note-taking guide, the diagram is there with the blanks in it for the student to fill in and complete it. And again, with the key points, the talking points from the lecture listed above. So you can see how this would be useful for the student that likes to take notes without providing the huge distraction of trying to write down everything you say. PowerPoint is surely a blessing and a curse. I'm a big fan of it, but one that I've seen in training programs that I've been through is when the lecture, the PowerPoint, the handouts or note-taking guides are not congruent, when they don't track in the same direction, when they're in different orders, when the fonts and the language are not the same. This creates a huge classroom distraction, and you'll know it when you see it because people are flipping through pages in front of you while you're trying to talk to them. And it really is a block to learning. So you really have to avoid those common mistakes. Make sure your PowerPoint slides are clean, lean, Make sure that they have limited amount of verbiage on them. Visuals are good, but really shoot for a high standard on your PowerPoint slides. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the talk about handing out, I'm personally not a fan of handing out copies of the PowerPoint slides. I think it takes the illustrations out of context. And if you have so much verbiage in your PowerPoint slides that it would serve the purpose of your lesson plan, your PowerPoint slides are too busy anyway. So I leave that to you and your individual preferences. But again, I generally tend to recommend against handing out PowerPoint slides. Make a solid note-taking handout instead. Well, most of the time when we're developing law enforcement training, we basically have to pound a square peg into a round hole. We're told you have 8 hours to teach these officers X. Rather than saying they need to learn X, tell me how long this will take. That would be a preferred way to do it. But we all know the reality of it is if you have 30, 40, or 50 required in-service training hours per year, you have to hammer those square pegs into the holes because that's all the time you're going to get. So there is an art and a science to actually scheduling, sequencing, and perfecting your training. But you have to have the lesson complete before you can try to do that. Don't make the mistake of blocking out a week-long schedule and trying to force fit your blocks of instruction into it. You'll find it frustrating and you'll wind up leaving gaps in your training program. So basically, work on a perfect schedule once all the other documentation is complete. It should be one of your last steps. And you have to ask yourself, does this sequence make sense to the participant? Are they learning the skills in a building order? When we're talking about performance-based training, we're generally looking for a skills-building exercise where each successive lesson builds on the skills learned in the one before. Your schedule should reflect that. It makes no sense if you're teaching a class on electronic surveillance to have the first step be write a wiretap affidavit and have the last step be let's talk about the Electronic Communication and Privacy Act. Well, that's 180 degrees out of phase. We have to learn the policy and the law first before we can apply it in a practical exercise. And again, that's an exaggerated example, but I think you see what I mean. You have to present it in a logical order. Now, guessing the time is something that comes with time as a developer. You will look at your program, you'll look at your lesson plan, and you'll be able to give a good guess on what you think the time will take to basically present the material and check in with the whatever performance standard or measure that you put with it. Those best guesses are what actually go into your model schedule. If you use a modular approach where basically each one of your learning objectives is an independent freestanding module in your training, it's easier to make time adjustments and time estimates. You also may find a client or agency that wants less or wants more. Well, you can use these building blocks, these modular building blocks, to either decrease or increase your training package. It gives you that added measure of flexibility. So basically, the way to do it is to construct each one of your enabling performance objectives as an independent freestanding lesson. And when they're strung together in a program, you'll have a complete training package. This is an example of a perfected model schedule. This one is in draft. And it basically, you can see in this particular case, this is a package of instruction for the Tennessee Valley Public Power Authority. There, the client preference was to have all the lecture-based material on the first day of instruction and then the practical exercises on the second day of instruction. I'll tell you from a training manager point of view, that's not a good practice. It's not a better practice. A better practice is to have the lecture and then the corresponding practical exercise and interweave those together. So you have classroom learning followed by hands-on experience. But in this case, that's not what the client wanted. So we were able, because it's modular, to restructure the training so that we put all the lecture on the first day and all the practical exercises on the second day. And they had some logistical reasons that they wanted to construct it that way. But you can see by using a modular schedule, it gives that flexibility. Also, a simple modular schedule like this gives the participants a sense of how long and what order the training will take place in. So, everything that we talked about so far, we're we actually pull this together into the curriculum build process, pulling it all together. Again, we're using the ADDIE model to start, and that's where we're doing our analytics, our design development, implementation, and evaluation. We lock all these processes down. We set our system of performance objectives, a terminal performance objective, which is basically what the training is intended to accomplish, along with a bunch of interim performance objectives that feed the greater objective. Once that's established, we build our lesson plan, which we're going to write in the form of a narrative manuscript. We're going to come up with the metrics. How are we going to measure performance? How are we going to establish what success looks like? And again, you have to remember these things have to be observable, measurable, and replicable. And they generally, when you're describing them, it's with action verbs, something that the student must do that you can observe and document. From there, we'll work backwards to create a study guide based on the content of the lesson plan. Then, if we choose to use it, we'll use a PowerPoint slide, making sure that the lesson plan, the study guide, and the PowerPoints are congruent and presented in the same order. Once we've accomplished all of this documentation, it will give us a sense of how long and what it will take to achieve, and that's when we build our model schedule. If you follow this process and you flip over your work when it's done and compare it against the IADLEST National Certification Program rubric, you'll find you've touched everything that it requires as far as structure is concerned. Now, the content elements that we talked about meeting your learning objectives, being free of discriminatory content, being written conforming to the standards of written English, well, those are content issues as well. But if you have this structural system in place, this part is not a part you'll have to worry about. These pieces will all be included in your submission to the National Certification Program to support your work. And I think you'll find that it will sail right through. How do you get started? Well, do all your development with the rubric in mind. Sit down and really take some time to study it. Take it apart. Figure out what it means to your training program. Key attention to detail. Be sure that there's a level of detail that's commensurate with the material that you're teaching. Too much detail and you lose your audience. Insufficient detail, you don't give them the tools that they need to take the learning out to the street. Make sure it's all clear and concise. Some of the worst training that I've ever had is at one of the best places to be trained, in the Executive Leaders Program there. The professors would come in just to impress us with how important and smart they were. It's a room full of cops, firefighters, and emergency managers, and we're being beat to death with things like chaos theory, self-organizing systems, and networks versus hierarchies, in language that's very difficult for the layperson to understand. So fundamentally, that became a waste of everyone's time. It has to be clear, concise, in a way that the audience can absorb it and take it out to the street, do their job better, avoid lawsuits, and stay safe. That's ultimately what our training is all about. You have to keep track of your version control. You're going to make changes as you move through the system. Keep track, number them independently so that you can go back to your earlier work and tell which version is the most up to date. This becomes vitally important when you start deploying your training and changes in the law or legal precedent drive changes to your training. You're going to want to document when you've made that change, who received the early version of the training, who received the most up-to-date version of the training. And this maps into your archiving system. Folks, the simple fact is now that the best practice for archiving training documentation is 30 years, which is generally the maximum length of a career of a law enforcement officer. So you have to have a system to at least electronically archive all your materials through the life of the officers that receive it. This isn't difficult to achieve with the easy availability of really large portable electronic storage devices now. So scan and save the work that you do. It will become important later on, and all of you know this. If you're a training manager, when one of your officers gets into a jam, the first thing that the people ask for, whether it's internal affairs or opposing counsel, is the officer's training record. And they start taking a deep dive on that training content. You want to make sure that yours is right and it conforms with the standards of law enforcement training. And that standard today is the standard established by IADLEST National Certification Program. So it provides double duty there by giving you the standard that you know is defensible if your training content ever comes under legal review. And then finally, and this is, if you carry away one piece of advice from what we're talking about today, is talk to Peggy Schaefer at the National Certification Program. She is the know-all, be-all, and end-all to any of your questions about this. She held my hand through my earlier steps with this, and along with the good folks here at Envisage First Forward, were able to get me on a track where I was able to get my material to sail through the certification process just by doing a front-end work that's required to get it right the first time. So open a dialogue with these folks, talk to them. You'll find it can seem overwhelming, but if you do it in a systematic way, add some process to it in accordance with some of the suggestions I've given you today, you're going to build a training package that's going to achieve that national certification mark, and you know now that you've achieved the kind of excellence that your officers and agents deserve. With that, I'd be really happy to take any questions using the system here and do my level best to answer them, and that's anything at all. And if I talked about any of the concepts, the educational or academic science objectives here that didn't seem clear, I didn't explain them fully, please ask me about those as well, and I'll do my best to flesh them out for you.
Thank you, Joe. That's awesome to just get all of this information packaged so concisely in a brief period of time. I mean, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, obviously, and we're able to distill it down, synthesize it to the key points that folks that want to build training that conforms to national and academic standards can digest. So thank you so much for that. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. First, there's someone who would like a little bit more information on ADDIE, and where would they go to get additional information on that?
The ADDIE is actually, and again, I apologize for those of you that are familiar with this instructional design system. It's actually an engineering model that I think was developed in the 70s, and it was found that it actually would apply to the academic process as well. And frankly, if you just drop the acronym all uppercase letters ADDIE in your Google browser, it'll lead you to a number of educational sites that talk about the model, applying the model, and give you suggestions for using it in law enforcement training.
Excellent. We had just to remind everyone, we're still taking questions, so if you have additional questions based on this presentation, please feel free to type them in the lower left-hand corner of your browser window. Joe, one of our participants asked about how can we test for performance objectives if we're making an online class?
Well, that's a great question, and that is a little bit more of a challenge. One of the tools that we've used, in addition to the simple things like multiple choice quizzes that are strategically placed through the online presentation, problem solving and critical thinking. You basically take a situation that an officer may encounter in the course of his or her duties, and you let them solve that problem. And it takes a little bit more work, and it takes a skilled online designer to help you with this, but it really reinforces learning. And a lot of some of the work that we did in ICE involved video problems where the officer actually watched the scenario online and then had to answer questions and follow the cues that were presented in order to apply the learning that they'd received earlier. So it's really limited only to your imagination. Those are just a couple of examples, but it is a challenge to make sure you're contacting the audience, that they're picking up the material, and that they can demonstrate for you that they've taken the learning on board.
How do you, one other question that we got here from the audience, how do you build a student study guide? What are the steps that you go through?
Well, the method that I've always used, and this is why I do it in the order I do, is I basically start at the completion of the written lesson plan. So I have the written lesson plan in front of me, and I go and I isolate each of the learning objectives. Now, in each of the learning objectives, there are key points or ideas. I take those and I basically use a reduction method where I start backing things out of the lesson plan and put blanks in, blank lines, blank diagrams, again, things that coincide perfectly with the PowerPoint slides I'm using. And basically create, and by the time I'm done and I work my way all the way through the lesson plan, I'll have a note-taking guide that's 2/3 blank, 1/3 text, where the student can actually follow along and jot notes down, and make sure you leave adequate space for note-taking. And basically, I give them this bound guide to take away with them when they're completed the training.
And is it fair to say that doing something that way helps reinforce the key points that you are hoping the student is going to take away in terms of training transfer?
I think it is, Ari, and that's a good question. And that's the problem with the PowerPoint, handing out PowerPoint slides. The PowerPoint slides should be very lean and only have the key words that are it's not designed as lecture material. PowerPoint should be used as a way to keep you and the student in the same lane as you move through your lesson. The power is in your lecture. By having lecture notes in front of them, they actually have something that you know is accurate, that it contains the key points that are in your lesson plan, and that there's not much room for error. I'm fond of telling the story that when I went to the ICE Academy, one of the deportation officer courses, they were handing out the PowerPoint slides, and the deportation officers, when they got on the street, were actually carrying the PowerPoint slides around with them and relying on them as evidence of policy. And you can see where that could be problematic. So one of the first things I did at ICE was I rescinded that process, and the instructors were no longer allowed to hand out PowerPoint slides. It had to be a note-taking guide that was prepared by the instructor that was congruent with the approved lesson plan.
If you were to summarize the top 1 to 3 benefits of designing training in this way, what would you say to our audience?
The number one thing, and I really want everyone to carry this away, it's about legal defensibility. What you want is you want an independent third-party body looking at your material and attesting that it met that standard. It's not just you and your instructional cadre saying, hey, this is our training, we know it's good because we're good guys and we've been doing this a long time. Well, that's great, and you probably are, but what I want is a third party there that when my training is challenged in a court of law, they're going to step up and say, hey, you know what, they submitted this training, it hit every mark in our book of standards, and we attest to the quality and validity of this training. So it's about having that independent validity. The second thing is that ability that gives you portability, where basically if you have a solid instructional package there, you can hand it off to any qualified instructor, and they'll be able to deliver that same lesson plan. It's replicable. It can be done over and over again in the same way. And then finally, by harnessing that academic science and adhering to sound principles of adult learning, it gives you that added confidence that the audience is picking up what you're putting down, that you're teaching the right stuff, that they're getting enough of it, and that they can demonstrate to you they've picked up on the training and they can apply it before they leave the classroom. So those would be my top 3 reasons.
We have another question here from the audience. How applicable is a study guide in a class where there's almost no lecture and it's almost all hands-on?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we, the example I'll use is from the Albuquerque Police Department in the case of use of force training. You're right. You don't want officers thumbing through a 40, 50, or 60-page use of force policy. So what we created were job aids, basically laminated cards illustrated with the key principles put down in simple language on one side, and on the opposite side of the job aids, the actual specific legal references, the policy and law references that are required. And this helped them as far as articulating any use of force. It helped them to understand what the contents of the use of force policy were. So that's a great question. And again, that use of job aids in the place of note-taking guides would do this, would provide the same level of reinforcing the learning. That's a great question.
Another question, sort of related but not quite. If you have a lecture-based course, how do you reach kinesthetic learners? I mean, you've addressed reaching readers, people who are visual learners and auditory learners. What about those that are kinesthetic?
One of the things that seems to work with an audience like that are things like, and again, it sounds silly and somewhat elementary, but things like games and team competitions within the classroom. team building exercises, breaking them into small groups and setting them in competition with each other. One of the things about us type A law enforcement people, we are competitive, we are aggressive, and we want to win. So you really harness that, and it gets that level of involvement up for the less engaged learner or for the learner that doesn't learn through verbal means. There are also now devices that are out there that basically puts electronic control in the hands of the student. It's a little more expensive, where you can basically pull the students as they go regarding their level of learning, and the device captures that and gives you student feedback. So yeah, it's the limit to your imagination. And if you're on a low budget, it's really game playing and team building exercises are a great way to reach those learners.
There's a question about the rubric in and of itself that has cropped up here. It says the rubric requires 84 points to pass out of 136. I understand that 84 points will pass, but what if you get all threes on everything else and you get a 0 on content? Is free from discriminatory examples, terminology, and negative stereotyping?
Oh, that's a great question. You'll notice when you go through the rubric, there are automatic fail events built in through it. So even if you achieve the minimum standard as far as quantitatively, if you miss one of those key indicators, and that being one of them, it's grounds for an automatic failure. So I would caution you to pay particular attention to those. I think there's 3 or 4 of them that are grounds for automatic failure. So it doesn't matter how awesome your program is. If it's got discriminatory content, you're going to get it back without the certification seal.
As I recall, another one, Joe, remind me if I'm correct, is copyright infringement.
Copyright. And they will screen for copyright. And let me speak to that for a minute, because this is a common question I get from clients and training customers. Just because something on YouTube is on YouTube does not mean it's copyright cleared. You have to be very careful about that. The thing that I tell folks over and over again, you want to use a local news clip, or you want to use a piece of a movie or a TV show, the path of least resistance is ask for permission from the copyright holder. I've never been told no. One of the biggest ones when I worked for ICE and I was doing ethics training in the management development program, I wanted to use a scene from Dirty Harry to spark discussion about extremes in use of force. I wrote to Warner Brothers, who's the copyright holder. They immediately got back to me, asked me what I wanted to use it for. They wanted to make sure it had no negative connotations for Warner Brothers, El Paso, which is Eastwood's production company, or Clint Eastwood. I explained it to them, and the next day by express mail, they sent me written authorization to use it. So don't be afraid. Ask it. There is a central copyright clearinghouse utility on the web right now. If you just put copyright clearance utility in your Google browser, it'll take you right to their website, and they hit all, whether it's Viacom, NBC Universal, Sony, they will find who the copyright holder is and get a message to them for you. The only exception is that anything generally created by the government or by a government agency is yours to use. Even with that, though, drop an email or a line and get permission. It can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Okay, that's all the time we have today. I think we have no more questions. Joe, I'd really like to thank you for providing your experience today and sharing that with all of us. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended today. We have recorded this webinar, and we will send it out in the coming days so that each of you can share it. We encourage you to share this information widely if there are other people within your organizations or that you know that could benefit from the things that we discussed today. That's it. Have a great afternoon, and till next time.
So long, everyone.